Hello, everyone. This is Chris from Pain and Glory, and I'm here to answer your questions on historical miniature wargaming. You are someone who is either new to the wargaming hobby in general, or you're someone who already has experience in wargaming, perhaps with a Games Workshop game, but you are interested in historical miniature wargaming. So I want this video and the videos that are going to follow to be a resource for you to follow because I know that there are a lot of questions that people have when they start the historical side of wargaming or just wargaming in general. So first, you probably already have an idea of this question if you are watching this video, but what exactly is historical wargaming? So historical wargaming is the use of a game or a simulation to play a historical battle or to recreate a historical battle, or you could play a hypothetical battle that maybe didn't happen in history, but is a battle that could have happened. So for an example, an imaginary battle between US forces and German forces in World War II, but that's not modeled after a specific actual battle. And pictured here, we have kind of the two modern origins of wargaming. Wargaming as a game and as a simulation evolved from chess over hundreds of years. People took chess and tweaked it so that rather than just being a strategy game that has the rules of chess, people tweaked it so that it would more closely match the historical battle of their time. So on the right side, you can actually see what look like some 1800s military officers playing some sort of game on a map with little colored blocks. And that's actually one of the modern inspirations for historical wargaming. It was known as Kriegspiel, which is German for war, literally war game. And it was developed in the early 1800s by a number of people in Prussia, which is modern day Germany, as a military exercise, a simulation not meant to be fun, but meant to be a simulation of early to mid 1800s black powder era warfare. And so this was not a game, but a lot of the rules of Kriegspiel influenced modern wargaming. One of the other big influences on modern wargaming is what's pictured over on the left, and that is actually a picture of H.G. Wells, who wrote War of the Worlds along with a lot of other things. He also wrote a book in 1913 called Little Wars. It has a much longer title. That's the short version of it, in which he gave simple rules for playing games with essentially small toy soldiers that were perhaps 2 or 3 inches tall. And at the time, his game involved actually laying these soldiers out on the floor, as you can see, and men in these early 20th century suits sitting on the floor with their soldiers and shooting little marbles at each other to try to knock the soldiers down. So a lot of what modern wargaming is a combination of the figures of the H.G. Well Little Wars and the more complex rules of the German Kriegspiel, although not all the rules have to be complex. Now, this is what historical wargaming is. This video is specifically about historical miniatures wargaming. So what is historical miniatures wargaming? Well, there are a lot of historical wargames that are board games. They use blocks or they use chits, little cardboard chits to represent units. Some of the more popular of these are games like the Command and Color series by Richard Borg, where Command and Colors Ancients and Command and Colors Napoleonics recreate battles of the ancient Rome period or ancient Greece or of the Napoleonic era, but use little blocks with stickers on them to represent your Roman legionaries or your French line infantry. Miniatures wargaming uses miniatures as proxies for real life figures. And of course, these aren't a one-to-one scale. You're not fighting an actual battle. This is not reenactment, but they are of a smaller scale. So you can see a couple different types of miniatures here. On the left, in ranks and ranks are some Carthaginian spearmen of the Punic Wars. In the middle, we have an M3 Lee tank of World War II. And on the right, in those gray-green uniforms, are Germans, specifically of World War I. We can see an officer and 2 soldiers accompanying him. And these are also representative of some of the different scales that you can play at. You can play small scales with just a handful of men, or maybe even a couple dozen, with the figures on the right. Those those are a little more than an inch tall. Those are called 28 millimeter. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you have these smaller scales on the left where that tank is about the size of a matchbox car. And then those figures over on the left are about the height of a dime. And you could see you could fit a lot more of them into the same space as you can fit only 3 of the German infantry for World War One. And we'll talk more about scale in a second. So if you're interested in historical miniature wargaming, where should you start? The very first place you should start is if you're choosing this hobby, it's because you're interested in history. And if you're interested in history, the number one place you should go is to pick a historical era or a region, geographical, that you are interested in. If you're not interested in a certain period of history and you are forcing yourself to play that period of history, you're not going to enjoy it. Now, lots of people pick areas of history they don't know a lot about so they can learn more and they become interested in them. But if you learn about a period and you're not interested in it, don't keep going if you're not interested in it. Now, these are not all of the eras of historical wargaming that are out there. Essentially, every era of history, every um, period of history, every part of the globe is covered by historical wargaming. There are historical wargames that go back to prehistory that involve cavemen with clubs and spears. Um, but some of the more popular eras of historical wargaming are things like World War II, World War One, and also World War II, and even World War One. A lot of these, I focus personally mostly on land battles with infantry, and in the modern period also vehicles. But there are lots of wargamers who also do air battles once the advent of air flight and planes, and also sea battles, both in the age of sail and also the age of coal or oil-powered propulsion. So World War II, you can have land battles, you can have air battles, you can have sea battles. World War One, you can really do the same, and World War One's probably the oldest war where you could also do air battles. There's the American Civil War. There's the Wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon. There's the American Revolution or War of Independence. For naval battles, the Age of Sail is very popular. The age of sort of not Wellington. Of the age of Trafalgar. Um, Outside of European history, you often have people pursuing samurai battles. Going back into earlier history, you have the wars of the Protestant Reformation and the English Civil War. Then you can go into the medieval period with Hundred Years' War, the War of the Roses, the Crusades, the early medieval period with Vikings and Saxons and Normans, also sometimes known as the Dark Ages. You can go back into the ancient period. Ancient Rome is extremely popular. Ancient Greece is very popular. And you'll notice that with few exceptions, a lot of these are very Eurocentric or Anglo-American centric. And this is because wargaming, especially in the 20th century, is very much rooted in England and America. Those are probably the two countries where historical wargaming is the most popular, and thus conflicts that involved England or involved America or involved the nations that were allies or enemies of those two countries are often the most popular war games. There are games and there are figures that cover, again, almost every conceivable period of history. So don't take this list as gospel of the only things that you can do. Just know that these are some of the popular periods that are going to be a little easier to find. Other things you absolutely can find. If you want to do the Spanish American War or the Mexican American War, is it the most popular period ever? No, but there are rules and there are figures and you can find them. Now, once you've chosen an era, let's say you just watched Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan and you really want to do World War II, or you saw 1917 and you want to do World War One, or you visited the Battle of Gettysburg, you visited Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and you want to do the American Civil War. What's next? And what's next is where things actually get a little more complicated, and that has to do with something I mentioned a little before, scale. What are wargaming scales? Wargaming uses a scale that measures figures' height. So the smaller figures and we have larger figures. And you can take an educated guess that the smaller figures, you're generally going to use more of them. They're going to give you a big looking army that take up less space. The larger figures are going to have more detail in them, but they're going to take up more space and they're going to take longer to paint. Now, wargaming uses a very unique scale. It's a millimeter scale in which it is measured from the bottom of a figure's feet to their eye line. And this is because some of the oldest wargaming figures were Napoleonic figures who wore very big, fancy hats, right? These soldiers in the early 1800s who wore these hats that were often more than a foot tall, and thus measuring how tall a figure is difficult if you can't actually see the top of their head because it's in this hat. And so people measured to the eye line. Some of the most common scales are 28 millimeter. Again, that's 28 millimeters from the bottom of the figure's foot to their eye line. Thus, the figure is probably 30 or 31 millimeters tall. 15 millimeter is also very common. It's about half the size. 10 millimeter and 6 millimeter are some of the smaller scales. There are other scales. You sometimes hear about 20 millimeter scale or 32 millimeter scale, but these are some of the more common scales. And you can see how those figures are compared to roughly an inch tall. A 28 millimeter scale is a little over an inch tall. A 15 millimeter figure is about 2/3 of an inch tall, and so on and so forth. If you are playing games that are primarily involving vehicles, especially naval games or air-based games, those are usually measured in more standard modeling scales, which is a ratio. For an example, a 1/72 scale means that something that is 72 feet long in real life is 1 foot long in the scale. So these are some, you can see some examples of these World War II German airplanes and how much smaller a 1-300 airplane is than a 172 airplane. And their uses would be different. If you want lots and lots of airplanes, it's going to be a lot easier to use 1-300 airplanes. If you want to focus on just a couple very high detailed planes, then something like 172 is going to be better. And then you have even smaller scales like 1/1200. Those are often used with naval battles when these ships are hundreds and hundreds of feet long. And so to shrink them down to something even close to being usable, you really need to shrink them down by 500, 600, 1,000 times so that they can fit on your table and really be of a good scale. Now, why do we have these different scales? It's because they have different uses. If you're playing a battle with only 30 individuals per side, you could use bigger figures. You can have more detail, but they're going to take up more space. If you want to refight the entire Battle of Waterloo, most people can't do that unless you're using very, very tiny figures. And even then, the real Battle of Waterloo had over 190,000 people. You're probably going to use very small figures. And then in addition to that, one figure, instead of representing one man, is going to represent 20 men or 50 men or 100 men. It's going to be a little abstracted. Not quite as abstracted as if you were using wooden blocks, but a little abstracted. And so these larger scales allow that more detail, but they take up more space, and thus they're more useful in smaller battles. Whereas the smaller scales, you'd want to use them for bigger scale battles. And you can see some examples of these. The two World War II armies here are both World War II German Africa Corps, made famous by Rommel. The picture on the top right is of a 28 millimeter scale. You can see a lot of the details on these men, their jackets, their weapons, their faces. On the vehicles, you can see the chipping of the paint. You can see the ridges on the tires. There's a lot of detail on this, but there's only about 20 or 30 individual figures, plus a handful of vehicles, a couple of trucks. There's one tank there in the background. There's some motorcycles. Whereas the picture in the bottom, that's 15 millimeter scale, and you have dozens of vehicles, and you have probably close to 50 or 60 individual figures up down in the bottom, plus a number of large artillery or anti-tank weapons. It takes up about the same amount of space, but you can have a much larger scale battle by using smaller scale figures. As another example, the picture in the top left are actually figures of my own. Those are Carthaginian elephants. The square that they are sitting on is only 1 inch to a side. So if I was playing with a 28 millimeter scale, those elephants would be enormous. They could be 5 or 6 inches tall, maybe 7 or 8 inches long. That would be huge. It would take up a lot of space. But by scaling them down, that's a 10 millimeter figure. Those humans are supposed to be about 10 millimeters from the foot to the eye. Those elephants only end up being about an inch tall, an inch deep, maybe half an inch wide. And so I can have Carthaginian elephants on my table without taking up an elephant's amount of room. It's really just an opposite relationship. The bigger the figures you use, the smaller the battle you're probably going to want to fight. The bigger the battle, the smaller the figures. Lots of people play big battles with big figures, but it takes up a lot of space. And for a beginner wargamer, I would not recommend it. Now, what skills do I recommend? There are lots of great scales, but the two scales I recommend for new historical war gamers are 28 millimeter and 15 millimeter. And those were the two scales of the German armies on the last page. 28 millimeter I recommend because it is extremely widely available. More figures are available in 28 millimeter than probably any other scale by a huge factor. And not only are they widely available, they're widely available at very low cost because they're so popular. They can be manufactured in large quantities, and that can save the manufacturer money unless they pass those savings on to you. It's, again, I said the most popular worst gaming scale, and this is going to be appropriate if you're playing games with any number of figures between 1 and maybe up to 60. I think 20 to 40 is a good sweet spot when you're playing 28 millimeter, but there are people who play 28 millimeter with only a handful of figures. Often Dungeons and Dragons is played at 20 with 28 millimeter figures. Um, but for a war game, a small to medium number of figures, 20 to 40 is a good spot. 15 millimeter is a little less common than 28 millimeter, especially when it comes to plastic figures. And the reason I'm focusing on plastic, there are lots of figures that are in metal. Plastic figures tend to be less expensive. And for a new wargamer, I want to get you into this hobby at a low starting cost. And so that's why I'm going to be focusing on plastic figures primarily. 15 millimeter, there's a lot of metal 15 millimeter, but those can be almost expensive as 28 millimeter plastic figures, depending on who you're buying from. However, if you are buying 15 millimeter in plastic, those are going to be a lot less expensive than 28 millimeter in plastic because they're about half the size. This is appropriate for games looking at, maybe 50 to 100 figures. If this is World War II, 15 millimeter lets you play a company of infantry plus a large number of vehicles. 28 millimeter lets you play a platoon of infantry, about 30 people, plus maybe one or two vehicles. And so, really, where do you want to play your game? How many figures, what scale of battle do you want to play is going to help determine where you want to go. If you want to refight the entire Battle of Waterloo, that's extremely ambitious, probably not someone where you want to start. You maybe want to start with just a little tiny section of the Battle of Waterloo where they're fighting over a hill or a farm or a certain stretch of crossroad. And that's a good place to start. Now, once you've picked your scale and once you've picked your era, now the question is where do I find my minis and where do I find my rules? And I'm going to make separate videos on those. So if you want to find out more information before my next videos come out, I'm going to recommend these are all YouTube pages. Little Wars TV is one of the best historical miniatures wargaming YouTube channels out there. They refight famous historical battles and they make it very accessible for people who know a lot about wargaming and people who don't know a lot about wargaming. And they're very well filmed, and you will just have a fun time watching them. Another good place that's going to have a lot of information is a website and a YouTube channel called On Tabletop. They often review figures, review rules. They play demo rules with the creators of those rules so you can see a game being played as a demonstration so you can see if you like it. Storm of Steel Wargaming is a after action report or a battle report so you can watch Storm of Steel playing a number of games and you can see again whether you like those games or not. I know he has more of a focus on 20th century uh, battles, whereas On Tabletop covers a wide variety of battles as well as fantasy and science fiction. And then if you're interested in the hobbying and painting side of the game, then that gives us Pete the Wargamer and How I Paint Things, also known as Sonic Sledgehammer. They are going to be showing you a lot of how to paint your figures, and they especially focus on 28 millimeter. But I know both of them, especially Pete the Wargamer, has some 15 millimeter content there as well. So that is it for today. In the future, I'm going to have more videos coming. My next video is going to be some recommended figures to get you into historical wargaming for less than $50 a person, and often less than that, more like $20 or $30 a person, depending on how many figures you're going to get, and also some good sets that you can buy, share with a friend, and then you can have rules and figures and be ready to go in no time at all. And I'll have a separate video with some recommended rules for beginners. So thank you very much. This has been Chris from Paint and Glory. And if you have any questions, if you're new to this hobby, please post them in the comments. I will be happy to answer them. Everyone, you have a good day.